Okay, so you know the name John Wayne Gacy, right?
Yeah, hard to forget a name associated with so much horror.
Exactly. 33 murders. Just think about that number for a second.
It was the highest number of murders attributed to a single person in U.S. legal history at the time. Absolutely shocking.
Really puts it into perspective, doesn't it? Just a truly dark story.
Definitely dark.
Uh,
And it makes you wonder, how can someone commit such atrocities, especially when they seem so normal to everyone around them?
that's exactly what we're going to dive into today, a deep dive on John Wayne Gacy. We're pulling from a few different sources to get a complete picture. You've got Wikipedia for the overall timeline, Murderpedia with some really chilling personal details, a more biographical approach from biography.com, and then we'll look at the specifics of his conviction and execution with IllinoisDeathPenalty.com.
So we're taking all those pieces, putting them together so you can really grasp the whole story, the key events, the background, all the details, without getting too bogged down.
Right. We want to make this comprehensible, digestible, but also, like we said, truly get into the unsettling nature of this case.
Because it's one thing to know the name and the number, but it's another to understand the man behind the killer clown persona.
The killer clown, just the name itself is creepy. So John Wayne Gacy, born in Chicago, March 17th, 1942, executed May 10th, 1994.
And each source kind of sheds a different light.
Yep.
Wikipedia gives us that timeline. Murderpedia hits us with those harsh facts. Biography.com goes into the story of his life. And IllinoisDeathPenalty.com focuses on the legal aspects.
So let's start at the very beginning, his early life. And it wasn't exactly a happy one.
No, not at all. From what we see, he had a really tough childhood.
Yeah, dominated by an alcoholic, abusive father, both verbal and physical abuse. Imagine growing up with that.
And that kind of constant negativity, that lack of validation, it can really mess you up. It makes you wonder how it might have contributed to his need for control later in life.
Absolutely. I mean, the sources talk about how his father would put him down constantly, called him names, compared him unfavorably to his sisters. There's even an account of him being beaten at just 4 years old for just playing with car parts.
4 years old. That's just heartbreaking. And his mother tried to protect him, but it seems like that just made things worse.
Yeah, it kind of backfired. The father accused him of being a mama's boy, called him a sissy. It was a really toxic family environment.
Really sad. And then on top of all that, he was also exposed to sexual abuse at a young age. First, a brief encounter with another boy when he was 4, which was punished. And then, starting in 1949, he was molested by a family friend.
And he never told his father about that out of fear. So he carried all this trauma with him. But one thing that really struck me was that despite all this, he still loved his father and desperately wanted his approval.
Yeah, that's a complex emotion. You can both love and fear someone who's been a source of so much pain. It sounds like he always felt like he wasn't good enough for his dad.
Yeah, constantly trying to measure up, but never quite reaching the mark. And there's this detail that always sticks with me. He had a head injury when he was 11 from a swing.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that. It led to those blackouts he had as a teenager. Had to take medication for them.
It makes you wonder if that played any role in his development, you know? The sources don't explicitly connect it to his later actions, but it's definitely a part of his story.
It's certainly a piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
But let's move on to his early adulthood and his career path. Seems like he tried a few different things before landing in the construction business.
Yeah, for a while he actually worked for an ambulance service out in Las Vegas.
Really? That's interesting.
And after that, he spent about 3 months working as a mortuary attendant at Palm Mortuary.
That's a pretty unusual job, especially right after working in an ambulance service. You'd think you'd have seen enough death and trauma for a while.
You would think so. But what's even more strange is this incident where he actually got into a coffin with the body of a teenage boy.
Wait, what? That's seriously messed up.
It really is. And apparently it affected him so deeply that he ended up going back home to Chicago.
Makes you think about his fascination with death even back then. Like,
Yeah.
was this some morbid curiosity or something more?
It's hard to say for sure, but after he got back to Chicago, he didn't stay idle for long. He enrolled in Northwestern Business College, even though he never finished high school. And he graduated in 1963.
So he was ambitious, at least on the surface, wanted to make something of himself.
Yeah, it seems that way. He got a job as a management trainee at Nunbush Shoe Company. Then they transferred him to Springfield as a salesman, and he eventually became a department manager. He was climbing the ladder.
Doing pretty well for himself. And it was around this time that he got engaged to a coworker, Marlon Myers. This was in March of 1964.
And he was also getting involved in the community, too. Became super active in the Jaycees in Springfield.
The Jaycees, huh? Remember reading about that. He was a real go-getter. rose through the ranks quickly,
Hmm.
became vice president by 1965, and even got an award for being one of the most outstanding JCs in Illinois.
Yeah, he was charming, charismatic, knew how to work a room. But there's also this other side to the story, this darker side that starts to emerge during this time.
Right. The sources mention a second homosexual encounter he had, this time with a fellow JC who kept giving him drinks. It seems like he was struggling with his sexuality, trying to reconcile it with his seemingly perfect life.
Absolutely. And then in 1966, he married Marlon Myers. They had a son in February of 66 and a daughter in March of 67. He describes this time as perfect, mostly because he finally got his father's approval.
Oh, wow. So that must have meant the world to him.
Yeah, his father even apologized for all the abuse during a visit in July of 66, right before he passed away in December. So there was this brief moment of reconciliation, a sense of closure, maybe.
But it's also kind of tragic, like he finally gets what he's always craved, but it's right before his dad dies.
Totally. A bittersweet moment. But let's move on to his time in Waterloo, Iowa. That's where things take a really dark turn.
Yeah, Waterloo. That's when the cracks in the facade really start to show.
So he moved there in 1966 to manage his father-in-law's KFC restaurant.
Colonel Sanders, huh?
Yeah, well, he apparently took to the role with gusto, insisted on being called Colonel, brought fried chicken to every JC's event, really embraced the whole thing.
And he kept climbing the ladder with the JCs too. Became outstanding vice president in 67, served on the board. He was a popular guy.
He was. But here's where things get really disturbing. The sources talk about a seamy side to the JC life in Waterloo. Drugs, pornography, prostitution, even wife swapping. And Gacy was right in the thick of it.
Wow, that's a far cry from the outstanding vice president image.
Right. Totally different picture. And it gets worse. He started a club in his basement specifically for young boys. He'd give them alcohol and make sexual advances.
So this is where the predatory behavior really starts to manifest itself.
And in March of 1968, he gets arrested for the first time. He was accused of committing sodomy with a teenage employee named Mark Miller and attempting to assault another boy.
I remember reading about that. Miller said Gacy tricked him into getting tied up, then raped him. Horrible.
Absolutely horrifying. Gacy, of course, denied everything. Even took polygraph tests, which they said indicated deception. He claimed it was all a political setup orchestrated by Miller's father, who'd opposed his nomination for president of the Iowa JCs.
So he was playing the victim, but it didn't really work, did it?
Not in the end. He was indicted on the sodomy charge on May 10th, 1968. And then he made things even worse for himself by paying someone to beat up a witness who testified against him.
So not only was he accused of these horrible crimes, but then he tried to silence the people who were speaking out against him.
Exactly. And that led to more charges. So, facing mounting evidence and pressure, he finally pleaded guilty to sodomy and got a 10-year sentence.
10 years. That's a long time. But he didn't actually serve the whole sentence, did he?
Nope. He ended up serving only 18 months. And get this, while he was in prison, he was a model prisoner.
Wait, seriously? A model prisoner? That's hard to believe considering what he was accused of.
I know, right? But it's true. He got a job as head cook within months of being incarcerated, joined the inmate JC chapter, grew its membership, even advocated for better pay and living conditions for the inmates. He even got a Distinguished Service Award in 1970.
It's mind-boggling. Like, how could he be this upstanding, helpful person on one hand and then commit these horrific crimes on the other? It's a real Jekyll and Hyde situation.
It really is. And you have to wonder, was it all just an act? A way to manipulate the system and get out early?
I think it's safe to say that manipulation was a big part of his personality. But let's not forget, he was also divorced by this point, and his wife got custody of their kids. Gacy said he wouldn't try to see them again.
A clean break. So in 1971, he returns to Chicago. He and his mother buy a house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue in Norwood Park. Just an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. But that address would become synonymous with unimaginable horror.
That's where it all went down. The epicenter of his crimes.
Yeah.
Chilling to think about.
It really is. And shortly after moving back to Chicago, he reconnected with an old acquaintance from high school, Carol Hoff. They started dating and got engaged in August of 71.
So he jumps right back into trying to build a normal life. Marriage, family, the whole 9 yards.
Yep. They got married on July 1st, 1972. Carol and her 2 daughters moved into the Summerdale Avenue house. Gacy's mother moved out right before the wedding.
Setting up the perfect family image. But behind closed doors, things were very different.
Oh, absolutely. He also started a part-time construction business around this time, PDM Contractors. painting, decorating, and maintenance. He got permission from his probation officer, initially worked evenings doing small repairs and stuff.
But then it grew, right? Became his main gig.
Exactly. By mid-73, he quit his cooking job to focus on PDM full-time. But his marriage started to crumble. In 75, he told Carol that he was bisexual. And after Mother's Day that year, he stopped having sex with her altogether.
That must have been devastating for her, to have him basically admit that he wasn't attracted to her anymore.
And it gets worse. He started spending most nights away from home, making excuses about work and business meetings. Carol started noticing things too. Young boys coming to the garage late at night, gay pornography, men's wallets and IDs.
Those are some huge red flags.
They are. And when she confronted him about it, he'd get angry. The tension must have been unbearable.
It's like he was living a double life, the respectable businessman and family man by day, and then something much darker at night.
And his business, PDM contractors, played a role in that too. He mostly hired high school students and young men, many of whom he would proposition for sex. He'd offer them favors in exchange for sexual acts.
So he was using his position of power to exploit these vulnerable young men.
Exactly. And he'd even threaten them, brag about owning guns. It was a very toxic and predatory environment.
It's horrifying. And Carol eventually couldn't take it anymore. In October of 75, after a big fight, she asked for a divorce.
He agreed, but she stayed in the house until February of 76. The divorce was finalized in March on the false grounds that Gacy was cheating on her with women.
So he was still trying to maintain that public image, even during the divorce.
Absolutely. And during this same time, he starts developing his killer clown persona. He performed as Pogo and Patches at parties, events, even children's hospitals.
It's just so creepy knowing what we know now, that he was out there entertaining kids while also committing these horrific murders.
I know, right? And he rarely charged for these performances. He said it was a way for him to regress into childhood. Just chillin'.
Absolutely chilling. And that's where that killer clown nickname came from, this juxtaposition of the happy clown image with the reality of his crimes.
Okay, so let's talk about the murders themselves. The first known murder was Timothy McCoy, a 16-year-old boy who was killed in January of 1972. Gacy lured him from the Greyhound bus terminal, promising him sightseeing and a place to stay.
The Greyhound bus boy, they called him before he was identified.
Right. And they found his body buried under concrete in Gacy's crawl space. He'd been stabbed multiple times.
That level of brutality, it's hard to even comprehend.
It is. And then sometime between 72 and 75, he killed another unidentified boy and buried him in the basement. Then there was John Butkovich, a teenage employee of his.
And it seems like the murders became more frequent after his divorce in 76.
Yeah, the majority of the murders took place between 76 and 78 when he was living alone. It's like something snapped in him.
And his neighbors started noticing things too. Young men coming and going at odd hours, lights flickering on and off in the house, muffled screams. It's terrifying to think about what was going on in there.
Absolutely terrifying. And there's this whole list of victims, each with their own tragic story. James Hawkinson, Rick Johnston, Kenneth Parker, Michael Marino, William Bundy, Francis Alexander, Gregory Godzik, the list goes on and on.
So many young lives cut short.
Yeah.
And some of them were never even identified.
That's the really heartbreaking part. And then there was John Syke, who Gacy tricked into selling him his car, then murdered him. And John Prestige, who mentioned getting a job with a contractor before he disappeared.
It's like he was using his business as a hunting ground, preying on these young, vulnerable guys who were just looking for work.
It's sickening. And then there was Matthew Bowman, who was found with a tourniquet around his neck, and Robert Gilroy, whose father was a Chicago police sergeant. Imagine the pain that family went through not knowing what happened to their son.
And by mid-78, the crawl space was full. So he started dumping the bodies in the Des Plaines River.
He said he threw 5 bodies in there, but they only found 4.
And one of the victims they found in the river was Timothy O'Rourke, who had told his roommate about a contractor offering him a job.
That's right. And then there was Frank Landingen and James Mazzara. And finally, the disappearance that led to Gacy's arrest. Robert Piest, a 15-year-old boy who was last seen leaving a pharmacy where Gacy had done some remodeling work.
Piest's disappearance was what finally brought the whole thing crashing down. The police were already looking into Gacy because of the other missing boys, but Piest's case was what really got their attention.
Yeah, they put him under surveillance and started digging into his past. They learned about the disappearances of his employees, Gregory Godzik and John Butkovich, and they got a search warrant for his house.
And that first search turned up a lot of incriminating evidence. They found a roll of film that belonged to Piest, police badges, a gun, Mila's pornography, and even some personal items belonging to the missing boys.
It was pretty clear at that point that something was very wrong. And the more they watched him, the more erratic his behavior became. He even told his associates, Cram and Rossi, that he'd confessed to over 30 murders.
Over 30? That's insane.
It is. And then he went to visit his father's grave, like he was trying to get some kind of closure, maybe? Or maybe he was just losing it.
Who knows what was going through his head? But the police knew they had to act fast. They got a second search warrant, this time specifically for the crawl space.
And they arrested him on December 21st, 1978, on charges of cannabis possession and distribution. They were worried he might try to kill himself.
So they had to get him off the streets. And when they told him they were going to search the crawl space, he denied that Piest was down there, but then he confessed to killing a young man in self-defense and burying him under his garage.
That was John Butkovich. And then he took them to the I-55 bridge and showed them where he'd dumped the bodies in the river. He even drew a diagram of his basement, showing them where the other bodies were buried.
He was just spilling everything at that point.
It's like he couldn't keep it in anymore. And over the next week, they excavated the crawl space and found the remains of 26 bodies. They found 3 more bodies elsewhere on the property.
It's hard to even imagine what that must have been like for the investigators. The smell, the sight of all those bodies. It must have been horrific.
It must have been. And it was national news. Everyone was talking about it. The killer clown. It was a nightmare.
A nightmare come to life. And initially, Gacy confessed to killing 25 to 30 young men. He said he'd lure them in with promises of sex or work, then strangle them.
But later, he changed his story. Started claiming self-defense, even saying that other people had keys to his house and might have committed some of the murders.
Trying to deflect blame. But nobody believed him.
Nobody. His trial started on February 6, 1980, in Cook County, Illinois. The judge was Louis Garippo. And because of all the publicity surrounding the case, they had to bring in jurors from Rockford.
He was facing 33 counts of murder. It was a huge trial.
It was. And his lawyers tried to argue that he was insane. They said he had multiple personality disorder, that this other personality, Bad Jack, was responsible for the murders.
So he was trying to avoid responsibility again, claiming he wasn't in control of his actions.
Exactly. And he would make these callous jokes, too. Like, he said he was guilty of running a cemetery without a license. Just awful.
It shows a complete lack of remorse, no empathy for his victims or their families.
And the details that came out during the trial were just horrifying. They talked about how some of the victims were found with gags in their mouths, how they'd been tortured. It was unbearable.
And then there was Timothy McCoy, the first victim. The fact that he was stabbed and buried under concrete. It suggests a level of rage and premeditation that's just bone-chilling.
And in the end, the jury didn't buy the insanity defense. They found him guilty on all 33 counts of murder.
Justice was served, in a way, but it doesn't bring back those young men.
No, it doesn't. And he was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders and natural life in prison for the rest.
He was also convicted of sexual assault and indecent liberties with a child. Just a monster.
A monster, indeed. He was sent to Menard Correctional Center and then transferred to Stateville Penitentiary near Joliet for his execution. His last appeal was denied in October of '93, and his execution date was set for May 10th, 1994.
So he had over a decade on death row to think about his crimes. Did he ever express any remorse?
Not really. In his final hours, he was reportedly pretty chatty that he said the families of his victims wouldn't get any comfort from his death. He even accused the state of murder.
Wow. Still deflecting blame until the very end.
Yeah. His last meal was fried chicken, fries, a Coke, and strawberry shortcake. And then he was executed by lethal injection. Some reports say his last words were, "Kiss my ass." But the prosecutor who was there said he didn't say anything.
So we're left with these conflicting accounts, these unanswered questions. Just like so much of his life, there's this shroud of mystery and manipulation.
And even though he's gone, the impact of his crimes continues to ripple through time. Those families will never forget their sons, their brothers, their friends.
And it forces us to confront the darker side of human nature. The fact that someone can seem so normal, so charming, and yet be capable of such unimaginable evil.
Exactly. It's a reminder that we can never truly know what's going on inside another person's mind. And it makes you question everything, doesn't it?
It does. It makes you wonder how many other John Wayne Gacys are out there hiding in plain sight.
That's a chilling thought. And it's something we all need to be aware of. We can't just assume that everyone is who they appear to be.
Absolutely. We need to be vigilant. Pay attention to the red flags. And never be afraid to speak out if we see something that seems wrong.
It's the only way to protect ourselves and our loved ones from becoming victims of these kinds of horrific crimes.
And hopefully, by understanding the case of John Wayne Gacy, we can learn from it and prevent something like this from happening again.
It's a dark story, but it's a story that needs to be told. We need to remember the victims and learn from the past.
And never forget that evil can lurk beneath the most seemingly ordinary facade.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left with one final thought. How did Gacy's early life, his experiences, his relationships all come together to create this monster? Was it nature or nurture or a combination of both?
That's a question that psychologists and criminologists have been debating for decades, and there's no easy answer. But by understanding the complexities of this case, by looking at all the different factors that contributed to Gacy's descent into darkness, maybe we can get a little closer to understanding how to prevent future tragedies.
And that's something we all need to strive for, because even though it's uncomfortable, even though it's scary, we can't just ignore the dark side of humanity. We need to face it head on, learn from it, and do everything we can to create a safer world for everyone.
I couldn't agree more.